Okay, great to see so many different countries that you're joining from. Okay, I guess since you can hear me, it's 3 o'clock, let's start. So my name is Amanda Davies. I'm a teacher trainer and writer, and I specialize in teaching young learners, primary and secondary students. Thank you very much for joining me today. I hope you've had a good week. I hope maybe you have finished your teaching and you've got a nice weekend ahead of you. I know many of you are currently teaching online, which means we're all spending a lot more time looking at screens than we usually would. So thank you for your willingness to spend a little bit more time looking at a screen today. Okay. Before we start this session, I've got a little bit of housekeeping to share with you. So this webinar is being recorded right now, and after the session, you will be sent a link so that you can watch it again. That will be in your inboxes straight after the session has finished. And within 3 days, you will get a certificate of attendance showing that you joined, and also a virtual goodie bag, so some nice things for you to explore there. Okay, so like you, I assume anyway, I'm now teaching my students online. I think a lot of us are affected by the global situation, and we're now having online lessons with our students. As you know, the topic of this webinar is secondary learners. So I'm now teaching secondary learners online, which, to be honest, is not something I planned to do. My online teaching is very much a response to the situation that we find ourselves in right now. So it's an emergency response to an emergency situation. And so for me, that means that my face-to-face classes that used to happen in a classroom now happen in a virtual space online, but they take place at the same time that they used to. They last for the same number of minutes, and we use the same materials. I used to use a course book, and I'm still using the same materials online. When it comes to secondary students, there isn't that much research about how online teaching works. And I'm not sure that the model that a lot of us are using, transferring our face-to-face classes to a virtual space, is the best model. But actually, we haven't really had much time to do anything else. It's not an ideal model, but it's what many of us are faced with. And as you know, the topic of this session isn't online teaching for secondary learners. The topic, as you know, is maximizing learning. And we're going to be talking about assessment for learning. But I think it's important to say that the strategies that we're going to be looking at today are very much directed at learning in the classroom in a synchronous setting, so for a certain number of hours at a particular agreed time of day. And if you've now transferred that to online, then this session is for you. The strategies will be hopefully useful for your online teaching now, perhaps even more so than in a classroom, because we're faced with quite a lot of challenges now that we're all trying to figure out how to run our classes online. So as I said, I've been using assessment for learning with my students for a long time. I think in my online classes, now that I'm teaching, it's more crucial than ever. And I think that's because assessment for learning is connected to assessment, but for me, the most important part of it is learning. And this session, we're going to look at why, how assessment for learning really supports our students' learning. So here's what's coming up in the session. We're going to think, first of all, about how AFL supports learning. We're going to look at a lesson and how we can integrate assessment for learning into that lesson. And then at the end, there'll be some time for you to ask questions if I haven't answered them in the course of the webinar. You can communicate with each other in the chat box. You can write questions for me during the chat box, but I can't promise I will catch them because I might miss it because I'm talking. So if I miss your question, then wait, save it till the end and write it to me then, and I'll be able to deal with it. But okay, so we'll get down to business. So we're going to think, first of all, how AFL supports learning. But before we do that, I'd like you to reflect for a moment, grab a pen and a piece of paper, and make a note or keep it in your mind. If you don't have anything to write on, write down 1 or 2 things that you already know about how assessment for learning supports learning. I'm sure you already know a little bit about it. Write down 1 or 2 ideas that you have for integrating assessment for learning into your next lesson. That's probably Monday. Maybe you're teaching at the weekends, or maybe it's even this evening. Or if you're not sure, 1 or 2 questions you have about assessment for learning. I'll give you a few moments to think about that now and make some notes on what you know, what you plan, or how you plan to use it, or if you have any questions. Feel free to also write your thoughts in the chat box as well. If you have some things that you know about assessment for learning, feel free to let us know in the chat. Okay, my chat got stuck. Okay. 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 If you've made a note of that, put it to one side. We're going to come back to it at the end of the session. I'm not sure if someone from Pearson is here and can help me, but I think my chat has got stuck, or maybe nobody's writing anything. I'm not sure. If you were my students, I'd love to gather together your knowledge and share it and do a bit of peer teaching, but we'll have to hold on to that thought for now. So let's have a look at the ways in which assessment for learning supports learning in the secondary language classroom, whether it's in a classroom or in a virtual space. And to understand how assessment for learning supports learning, we need to start by thinking about how assessment works in the English language classroom. In fact, we assess our students all the time. It's not only when we give a formal test. It's very well integrated into our teaching. When we ask our students questions, when we monitor, when we look and see who's got the right answers, who's struggling, who needs more support, we're constantly making judgments about level of English, about whether they've learned what we're teaching them or not, whether they're putting in enough effort, whether they're behaving. And we use this information, of course, to adjust what we're doing. We use it when we plan the next lesson. We gather all this information, and it's all very much connected to assessment. We know which students are the ones that need extra challenge, which ones need extra support. We're assessing all the time. And when we do this, we're using a combination of summative and formative assessment. I think you're familiar, a lot of you will be familiar with these terms already, but I think it's important to run through them before we start, because firstly, I think there's quite a lot of similarities between the two that we don't realize. And I think we also have to avoid falling into the trap of thinking that one is good, one is bad, that summative assessment is bad, formative assessment is what we should be doing, because actually they both have a place in the language classroom, and we should be using a combination of both of them. So summative assessment, which is also referred to as assessment of learning, takes place at the end of a learning cycle. That doesn't have to be at the end of the year. It might be the end of the semester, the end of the topic, or even the end of the lesson. So it can take place very regularly. But what's important is the focus is on achievement. We're looking to see how much our students have learned. That's our aim. It doesn't have to be formal, as I mentioned. It can be a short, like, vocabulary quiz at the end of a lesson. It can just be through observation. When we're monitoring, we look and see who got the answers correct and who didn't. So it doesn't have to be formal. And it's also, although we usually give a grade, we don't have to stop at giving a grade. Of course, as teachers, whenever we gather information on our students, we're using it. So the data that we get from summative testing, of course, we can use to adjust our teaching. Maybe it's the end of the year and we can't adjust it for that particular group, but maybe the following year when we teach the same level, we'll adjust what we focus on. We use it for tracking progress. The most important thing and the biggest way that it differs from formative assessment is that it's administered by the teacher. It's something that teachers do to students. On the other hand, formative assessment or assessment for learning, and I'll be saying AFL probably throughout this session, they're essentially the same, the different names for the same thing. Formative assessment takes place on a regular basis, and that means at the beginning of learning, while learning is happening, and at the end after learning has taken place. And the focus is on strengths and development areas. So whilst we might give a grade, the reason, our aim is to see what our students need to do in order to improve. The formats can be very similar to summative assessment. So it can be formal or informal. And the data is used in the same way, although I think typically we're using the data more regularly to adjust our teaching. But the biggest difference is that formative assessment, or AFL, is something that teachers and learners do together. They do this together, and it is integrated into learning. Okay, so why is it important to involve learners in assessment like this? I think that, well, all learners, but teenagers in particular, spend a lot of time guessing what they think the teacher wants. I think it's one of the characteristics of being a teenager that they often take the fastest route to finishing a task. They're busy people, they haven't got time, they want to do things as quickly as possible. And sometimes we want that. Sometimes we want students to work quickly. If we're doing reading for gist, or if we're asking students to do a revision gap fill, we might praise them for working quickly. At other times, we want our students to slow down and take their time. I've often felt frustrated when I've set up a really nice speaking task, nice discussion. I think, oh, good, I've got 10 minutes in my plan for this. And then the students finish after 30 seconds. They've got their hands up saying, we've done, we've finished, what's next? It can be frustrating for us. I think from the student's point of view, it can sometimes be a little bit unclear what we're looking for. They're not trying to annoy us. They want to please us, but they don't always know what the teacher wants. When students don't understand our expectations, and when they don't understand what successful work looks like, it's very possible that they might put a lot of time and effort into doing something that isn't ultimately what we are looking for. It maybe doesn't contribute to effective language learning. I think when it comes to teaching young learners, we often try and disguise serious learning. We try to make things fun and interactive, and we sort of try and slot the practice into these nice activities. And that's great because we want learning to be playful and fun and enjoyable for teenagers. But it's also important that they know what they're doing and why they're doing it. If our students don't complete a task in the way that we want them to do, a couple of things can happen. It might be that we ask them to repeat it or to try again or write another draft. We might give them a low mark if we don't have time for that. And that's frustrating for the students. They're probably not going to be that well motivated in the future if they don't understand why they didn't do well on a previous task when they, from their point of view, worked very hard. It's not very efficient. It's more work for the students. It's more work for the teacher. But when AFL is implemented successfully, students start to think more like the teacher. They understand where they are in their learning. They understand what's expected of them, and they can start to make judgments for themselves about how successful they were. This makes learning more efficient, more autonomous, more personalized, which is great. But thinking like the teacher isn't something that comes very naturally to teenage students. They tend to expect the teacher to be controlling everything. The teacher knows everything. The teacher imparts knowledge. So we need to help our students to start thinking in this way. And luckily for us, we have assessment for learning, which is essentially a set of strategies that we can incorporate into what we already do in the classroom, because we already think about why students are doing something and how they should do it and what we want them to achieve. It's just that we don't necessarily share it with students in a way that they can use this information. Assessment for learning isn't necessarily additional testing. It's not something additional that you need to do. It's just about maybe incorporating a couple of extra stages into instructions or particular stages of the lesson that help students think about these kinds of things. So I think why it's important, AFL helps students to understand our expectations so they know exactly what they have to do in a task. That encourages them to work more independently. If students aren't quite sure how to go about something or what we're looking for, they often spend a long time with their hand up, waiting to ask the teacher for clarification or for reassurance. But if they know exactly what they need to work on, what they need to focus, they can start to be more independent. They can recognize their own efforts and achievements. I think English teachers, we're quite good at praising our students, but a lot of it is quite general. So we'll tell the whole class, oh, well done, you all did very good. I enjoyed your speaking. But it's not necessarily easy when we've got a limited number of hours per week or semester with our students. It's not always easy to give everyone personalized feedback on what they have done well and what they need to do to improve. So it also allows them to focus on their development areas without necessarily having to wait for the teacher to write their end of semester report or end of year report. There's plenty of research that supports the use of assessment for learning in primary and secondary education. It's been used in mainstream education in the UK for quite a long time. I'm not going to go into that research today, but if you are interested in reading a little bit more about assessment for learning, then you can check out these resources. Okay, so let's think about a typical lesson and let's see where we can integrate assessment for learning to help our students think more like the teacher. We saw in our slide on formative assessment that AFL features at all stages of the learning cycle. So let's start with the start of the lesson or the start of learning, because we don't necessarily always finish teaching what we want to teach in one lesson. Sometimes we start something in one lesson, we finish it in the next. As teachers, when we plan our lessons, we always have an aim. Even if we don't write it down, we have a main aim that we want to achieve. We know what language or skills or knowledge or behaviors we want our students to be able to do better by the end of the lesson. And this is really helpful. It helps us to be purposeful when we plan our lessons. But also what's very nice is that once we've taught our lessons, we can reflect and we can work out whether we were successful or not. And when we achieved our aims, then we can congratulate ourselves. It feels really good. We know that we're effective. We taught a successful lesson. Our students learned something. It's also useful if we didn't achieve our aims, because we can reflect on why. We knew what we set out to do, and we can think about why didn't we get there. We can reflect on what needs to come in the next lesson to make up for this discrepancy. If students don't know the aim of the lesson, then they can't identify whether they were successful or not. It's quite difficult for them to identify their learning. I think, as I said, we often try to make learning fun and playful. And sometimes I think teenage students don't even realize it's happening. I think they often come to lessons, they know that they had a nice time, they chatted in English, they learned some words, but maybe they knew some of them already. And they don't necessarily always identify or realize how much learning they are doing in the classroom. There's a certain amount of repetition when you learn English. You encounter the same structures year after year as you move up through the levels. So I think the students don't necessarily always realize how much they are learning. But if we share our aims with our students, then they have that same opportunity to feel good about their learning. They can set goals for the future. They can figure out where they are going wrong. And I think this is quite important with online learning, because we are less in control of what's going on. We can't see people's notebooks. We just see faces. Sometimes with teenagers, they can look quite moody or quite deadpan. So we need to give the students a bit more responsibility. We need to make sure that they know that they are learning something, that they should put in effort and not just open a few other browsers to have a read while we're teaching our lessons. Of course, we can't just share our teacher main aim with students. It wouldn't mean much to them. But what we can do is share learning objectives. A learning objective is essentially a lesson aim that's phrased in a level and age appropriate way. Many course books include can-do statements for every lesson. I'm going to be talking about a lesson today. The lesson comes from GoGetter. I'll show you some more. That's the whole page, but I'll show you some individual exercises as we go through the session. And GoGetter, like many course books, includes a learning objective for every lesson in the form of a can-do statement. So here is the can-do statement from the writing lesson that I'm going to be talking about. I can write a leaflet with tips or instructions. Of course, if your course book doesn't have can-do statements, then you can write your own. But I think rephrasing what it is that you want to teach as a can-do statement is a good way to go about it. Another option is to use WALT. We are learning to. And then you can write the core learning that is going to happen in the lesson. Another option for sharing these learning objectives with students is to use KWL charts, where you have the topic at the start and then students have columns to complete, things to reflect on, the things that they already know, the things that they want to know. And then after the learning has taken place, they can go back and add all the things that they have learned, which is a very clear way for students to map out their learning and to recognize the value of the time that they spend in the classroom. However, I think on its own, a can-do statement or a topic isn't really that helpful when it comes to teenagers. I think if you ask the average teenager, oh, can you write a leaflet with tips or instructions? A lot of them are probably going to say, yeah, I think so. Yeah, I can do that. All that does is make them think, well, there's no point in this lesson. I can already do what she's going to introduce. So why am I wasting my time here? Perhaps I'll log off. With students, we need to incorporate reflection. It can be self-reflection, it can be done with a partner. So for my writing lesson, for my leaflet writing lesson, I gave my students these reflective questions. I asked them to think about the last time they wrote a leaflet and what they could remember about it that would help them to write this leaflet. I asked them to reflect on the grammar and the vocabulary that they thought that they would be using in their leaflet, to brainstorm the features, and then to think about what they needed to learn. So were there any gaps? Were there any things there that they weren't sure about? This gives students a very clear picture at the start of the lesson of the things that they know, but also the things that they don't know. So then they sit up and they think, okay, this lesson is worthwhile. It's also good for us as teachers because it might become apparent that they've written leaflets in another subject quite recently and they're quite confident with the features, but they're not sure how to do it in English. They don't know the grammar and the vocabulary. So maybe you can spend more time focusing on that and treat the features more as revision. It's frustrating when the teacher spends a long time introducing something that you already know. So this is a great way for us to find out what our students already know and therefore what we should focus on. It's also really good because it allows for peer teaching. It means the students can start to teach each other some of the things that we were planning to teach them, which makes our life much easier. At the end of learning, so it might not be the end of the lesson, you might be working on your leaflet for 2 lessons. So maybe in the first lesson, you're introducing the useful language and how to structure it. And in the second lesson, students are going to be drafting. You need to come back to these questions. You can rephrase them or you can give the same ones, but ask them to reflect now, comparing what they know now to what they thought they knew at the start. So they can discuss what was the grammar and vocabulary that they actually needed. What new words did they personally learn? Were there any features of a leaflet that they weren't sure about at the start of learning that they now know about? So they finish the lesson or they finish this sequence of work with a clear idea of what they learned. I think for lower level students, then you can let them choose what language they are going to do this in. It can be, you can cover your learning objectives in the first 3-4 minutes of the lesson. If they are a low level, I would recommend allowing them to choose what language they want to discuss it in. And then when you gather feedback from them, help them reformulate it in English. So we shouldn't let our lower level students miss out. For me, it's more beneficial to have a couple of minutes of children's own languages and then help them to say what they want to say in English after. Learning objectives do a number of things. They have a number of benefits. I think the first thing is it gives real purpose to the lesson. Students know what they need to focus on. It's quite hard to concentrate for 60 or 90 minutes, particularly on a screen, I think, with online lessons. And it means that the students can sit up and pay particular attention at the parts of the lesson that they know they need to work on, because they didn't know at the start what language. So they know that the language presentation is going to be very important for them personally. And they can see the point of the lesson. Learning is more purposeful. It also makes the lesson relevant for each student. They'll have different things to focus on, so they know the lesson is relevant to them personally. Really important, I think it's excellent for self-esteem. Students can show what they know, which is very nice. It's great when you can share the things that you know and peer teach. So very good for confidence building, very good for self-esteem. It avoids this sort of frustration if you start introducing something and actually the students already know the vocabulary or they know what you're trying to tell them. It's a bit frustrating for everyone. It avoids this situation because it allows the teacher to adjust the focus of the lesson. I'm not saying that we would write a whole new lesson plan, but we might adjust the focus of the things that we have planned. Some of them we might say, this, I can treat it more as revision. This is going to be a real problem. I need to spend more time here. And finally, it gives more responsibility to the students because they are able to identify for themselves what they need to learn. And at the end, they're able to look back and think, okay, this is what I learned. And I think, as I say, in the classroom, it's important. In the virtual classroom, it's also very important because we don't really have as much information as we would if we were monitoring and moving around the classroom and looking over our students' shoulders at how their work is going. So what it means is at the end of the lesson, students know that their time in the classroom was worthwhile. They knew what they were aiming for, and they were able to assess if they got there or not. Learning objectives don't have to relate only to writing lessons. They can relate to whatever it is that your students need to learn. Generally, a learning objective should be written about the most significant learning that students are going to do in a lesson or series of lessons. It could be related to grammar and vocabulary. It could be related to more behavioral things or skills related, such as showing interest in an idea, using expressions and gestures. Again, very important online because I think it's even more important to show that you're listening. It's kind of a bit disconcerting to look at deadpan faces. So they should relate to the most significant thing that you are going to be teaching. They don't have to incorporate everything that's going to go on in the lesson. Okay. Once you have introduced your learning objective, the students have reflected on it and discussed it, you're ready to get on with your lesson. In this writing lesson from GoGetter, I went on and I proceeded with the tasks in the book. There were some very nice tasks that asked students to engage with the text first comprehension, later looking at the structure, the grammar that was required for this particular leaflet was the imperative. So there was some nice tasks for practicing the imperative, some good open questions to get students thinking. So we went on as normal with the lesson. As I said, the learning objective should be connected to the most significant learning, which is writing a leaflet. And learning objectives go hand in hand with success criteria. If the learning intention informs students what they are going to learn, the success criteria inform them of how to go about it. How can they be successful? What do they need to pay attention to be successful? And here are the criteria that my students came up with for this leaflet task. The task was to write a leaflet about reducing rubbish and saving electricity. And the success criteria that we agreed on was to write a draft or a plan, to use 5 or 6 examples of the imperative, also use the useful language from the useful phrases from the writing box, and a few more success criteria for you there. Success criteria work best when they are generated by the students, but obviously they need the support of the teacher in order to do this. If it's teenagers, otherwise they would probably decide to write one paragraph and draw a picture or something. So they do need the support of the teacher. So I generally elicit ideas from the students. I ask them, okay, what do you think you should use in terms of grammar and vocabulary? How many examples? I write these on the board. I also get the students to write them in the notebooks. Although if they're short on time, maybe I would just write it on the board or display on the screen. So that students can refer to them while they are working on their tasks to keep track of if they are doing all the things they should be doing, and they can refer to them after to make sure that they included all the points we discussed. I usually give the success criteria immediately after setting up the tasks. So I would give instructions, tell them they're going to be writing a leaflet, and then say, okay, good. So how will you know if your leaflet is successful? What do you think? How should you go about it? What should you do first? And I think success criteria work well for larger tasks where students have got a number of different things to keep in mind. I use them very often for speaking and writing tasks. So here are a couple more examples of success criteria for writing and speaking tasks. The first one, students correctly identified that an adventure story should be enjoyable. So that was the first thing. They knew that their story would be successful if people enjoyed reading it. Easy way to test that is to give it to their partner to read. On the right there are some success criteria for a speaking task. So it was reminding students what structures they should use, reminding them to ask a follow-up question, because I think teenagers very often, particularly if you're doing a mingle, a find someone who type activity, you set them up, off they go, and they're just asking questions and answering yes or no. So reminding them that they should be asking follow-up questions, that they should show interest, because again, this is something that maybe teenagers aren't so good at. We can also use success criteria for receptive skills, so reminding students how to go about a reading task. So on the bottom, there are success criteria for reading. We tend to guide students through receptive skills lessons step by step. So we set up the gist, then we do feedback. We set up the detail, we do feedback. I think students sometimes think that this is just something we do in the classroom, and they don't realize that these are good techniques that they can use. If they're preparing for an exam, for example, then this is still a good technique they should use. And I'm surprised often that my students don't realize that. We do all this work on sub-skills in the classroom, but then as soon as they're doing a test, you see them just reading very slowly, word by word. So it's to remind them of these processes and giving them responsibility to use these processes. And if they say, oh, it doesn't work for me, well, then fine, they don't have to do it. But it's a guideline for them. Success criteria are also very useful when we want students to give each other feedback. I've had the situation many times where I've asked students, like after speaking or after writing, to give their partner some feedback. And I always say keep it positive, but what they always do is focus only on the negatives. They love pointing out each other's mistakes. They identify all the things that went wrong, all the things that they did badly. And strangely, they kind of enjoy this, but it's not that helpful. This kind of feedback from the teacher would be very demotivating. From each other, it also doesn't really help. It doesn't help anyone to improve, being told what you're doing wrong. You need to know, well, what should you have done to make it right. And feedback is an essential part of assessment for learning, of AFL, whether it's from a peer or from the teacher. Here is a quote from Hattie. talking about feedback and the impact on learning. And Hattie says that the most powerful thing to enhance achievement is feedback, and that we should give dollops of feedback, lots and lots of feedback. And that doesn't mean doing tests and giving grades. It means providing information about how and why the student understands or misunderstands and what direction the student must take to improve. Which means we need to improve the feedback that we give to our students. And we can also, because assessment for learning is great for autonomous learning, independent learning, we can improve the feedback that they give to each other. And of course, success criteria are a great way to get students to give each other balanced feedback, because they know what to listen for. They're probably going to get some positive feedback, because if we've agreed with students, okay, you need to answer these questions and you need to use the present perfect, they're probably going to use some examples of the present perfect, and then the feedback is, okay, well done, I heard you use the present perfect. Oh, you made a mistake with it in, when you were talking about your holiday to Italy. But they're more likely to be able to give each other feedback that is accurate and helpful. I think often our students, they might be able to make judgments on each other and on how well they did a task, but they don't always have the framework for giving that kind of information to each other. They don't have the language. So one thing I always do with my students early on in the year is to introduce useful language for giving each other feedback. So ways to praise, and also softer ways to point out the negatives. I also think it's very important to talk to students about what it is to be a good talker and what it is to be a good listener. And I think with online lessons, this is crucial. I think it's a really nice idea at the start of the year, or any time that you notice that there's a problem with pair and group work, is to talk about, get students to identify what are the characteristics of a good talker. You can give them a list to choose from, and they can decide if they are rules for a good talker or not. And the same for a good listener, and making a checklist. I always have a checklist up in my classroom. My students have a checklist in their notebooks. So when they are engaging, not only in peer feedback, but in pair and group work, they can check their own participation, if they are being a good talker, if they're being a good listener or not. A kind of ongoing success criteria. And as teachers, we also, I think, need to be careful about the feedback we give. We tend to give an awful lot of feedback, but a lot of it is very general. We praise the whole class. We tell everybody well done, everybody that we're happy with them, that we heard good examples of the language. But it's not always personalized. I think sometimes students sit there thinking, oh, well, she's saying everyone did a great job, but I'm a bit confused. I don't really understand what I was supposed to do this lesson. So we need to also work on our feedback all the time. Assessment for learning typically requires or calls for formative feedback. There are some characteristics of formative feedback. So first of all, it's based on agreed success criteria. So just like the students can use success criteria to give each other feedback, we should also use it. We don't have to give feedback on everything. We should give feedback on the things that we've asked our students to pay attention to. Of course, they're going to make lots of mistakes. If they're doing writing or speaking, they're going to make lots of mistakes. They're going to attempt to use language that they haven't learned yet. They're going to forget about language that we studied last year. But what we should be giving feedback on is how well they've used the language that we introduced, the language that we wanted them to use. And that feedback should include things the students have done well, what students should have done better, and it should also give improvements of how students can improve, and they should have time to do that. So here is the feedback I gave one of my students on their leaflet. This student had written some nice tips. There was a good introduction and conclusion. It was very attractive. They hadn't written a draft, and they'd forgotten about the imperative. So they'd made quite a few mistakes with the grammar. I didn't mark the text, so I didn't get my red pen out and mark anything, and I didn't give it a grade. I just gave the students this written feedback. You might see this referred to as 3 stars and a wish. So that's feedback that includes 3 things, could be 2, could be 4, that were good or that were successful, and 1, I've got 2 here, ways to improve. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to give a grade, but I think we have to think about the purpose of why we are giving a particular task. And here I wanted my students to get better at writing leaflets. For me, it was developmental. The students had this information and they had time in the lesson to go away and make some revisions to try and improve their work. They could help each other because obviously some of them were told, oh, you've used the imperative very well. So this student would go to one of their peers and get some support that way. I don't think that when we ask students to redraft, we have to keep taking in endless drafts and marking them. I think we have to trust our students a little bit. They need to become more autonomous. So I think it's reasonable to give them the feedback, give them some manageable things to do so the student doesn't have to go away and correct every mistake they make. They only have to look for those 5 or 6 examples where 5 or 6 sentences where they should have used the imperative. If I thought the student was going to struggle, then maybe I would have underlined where and said, okay, correct the underlined sentences in the text. You have to find what works well for you and your students. I think using the success criteria for our teacher feedback is excellent because it means we don't have to analyze each text. We collect and scrutinize it to work out what we should focus on. Sometimes students write texts, they're a little bit of a mess and we don't know what feedback we should give. So it helps us to zone in on those important areas. That speeds things up quite a lot. Although just because we've used success criteria doesn't mean we're restricted to them. If our students have made attempts or they've successfully used complex language or something we haven't taught yet, then of course we can praise it. If students have made mistakes with recent language, so maybe the last unit or 2 units ago, we can remind them. We might send them to a particular page in the workbooks for some remedial work. So when we shouldn't be restricted by our success criteria, we should use them to benefit us and to benefit our students. This kind of feedback is actionable for students. It means they can go away and actually do something about it. Okay. Here are some more examples of formative style feedback. Again, it's not only connected to our writing lessons. We can give formative feedback anytime that we're monitoring or walking around or listening to our students. It's just, I think, a matter of us becoming more mindful about not just telling students, oh, well done, or this is good, or this is great work, excellent work, but actually thinking about what it is that was good and what it is that they personally can do to improve. Okay, so if we go back to our lesson from GoGetter, our leaflet writing lesson, it's very good to finish every lesson with some reflection. That might be returning to our learning objective, but that assumes we've achieved it in one lesson. And as I say, we might be working on the same learning objective across a number of lessons. It might not happen in one. We can still build reflection into our lessons, and I think reflection is key for students getting better at learning. We can build reflection into lessons in a number of ways. Sentence stems are an excellent way to get students to think about what happened during the lesson. I wouldn't recommend giving 7 sentence stems in one lesson, maybe 1 or 2. We can even cater the sentence stems we give based on what happened in the lesson. So if you noticed a lot of students were struggling or a little bit confused, you might give them the sentence stem, I need more help too. Because then we're not blaming them that they didn't do well in the lesson. We're saying, okay, let's think about what you didn't understand, and I'm going to help you, so let me know. we can give them some reflective questions. And again, I think 1 or 2 questions in the closing moments of the lesson are enough. We wouldn't want to give 4. Again, we can base the question on what happened during the lesson. So if we think students were very successful in their learning, we can ask them to think about what was the most important thing they learnt. Exit cards are also very nice. I find they work quite well at the end of maybe a unit or a sequence of work, where students write down 3 things they learned, 2 things that were interesting, and a question that they have. These can be written on the board. Students can copy them into their notebooks. Another option is to introduce reflection via learning diaries. There are some online platforms that involve sort of online portfolios that might be good for our current situation, but it can also just be a couple of pieces of paper, scrap paper stapled together. It's essentially a designated place for students to reflect on their learning, and it's a direct line of communication with the teacher. Sometimes teenagers can be a bit reticent to put their hand up and tell the teacher, oh, I don't understand, or I'm struggling, or I need more help. But if they've got a learning diary and they can write it, it feels a little bit safer and a little bit easier for them to admit maybe that they're having a problem. They can record here things that went well in the lesson, questions they have, successes and challenges, and they can also keep note of their aims and goals. And as they look back over their learning diary throughout the year, they can see, oh, what were my aims and what can I do now, and all this learning that's taken place. You might make it more formalized. Rather than scraps of paper, you might print out some handouts such as these, where students can maybe build up over a unit the new vocabulary they're learning or new grammar skills that they're learning. You need to find what works for you and your students and adapt it and take it from there. I think anything that gives our students a voice, not only at the end of the lesson, but throughout lessons. I think we typically find things like response cards that we use when we're checking answers. So if you've done a true and false task, rather than asking students one by one, okay, what's number 1? Is it true or false? Number 2, every student can show the answer using their own response card. But I think these kind of response cards are also very good for students to be able to indicate how they're feeling. In particular, traffic light cards, we can ask students to tell us how they feel about their learning by holding up the traffic light card. So if they understand, they show us green. If they're not sure, might need a bit more practice, they show us orange. If they're struggling, they show us red. But I think we can use them in more ways. I think rather than asking students to hold things up and publicly declare if they're having trouble or not, we can ask students to put them on their desk. So if you need more help, then just place the red card on your desk. Or we can ask students to think about how they're feeling that day, because teenagers' life isn't always that easy. So we can ask students, how are you feeling today? Do you want me to correct you a lot or not? And if they want correction, they can put the green. And if they're a bit like, oh, I don't, I'm feeling a bit lacking in confidence, I don't want to be, corrected every mistake, they put the red. As well with participation, it's another way to give students a voice, so that they can communicate how they're feeling about their learning, also maybe how they are feeling on a particular day, whether they need more support, whether we need to be a bit gentle with them or not. I think a few considerations when it comes to assessment for learning. It doesn't have to replace other testing methods. So I think it's essential that we give tests. Students expect them, their parents or caregivers expect them, and it's very good to do them at the end of the semester, the end of the year, mini quizzes. Students are going to have to take exams, formal exams in life, at least until they finish university. And beyond that, there are certain situations where we have to sit exams, and we need to prepare them for this and train them in strategy. So assessment for learning isn't there to replace the testing that you're doing. It's there to support your teaching and to support learning. It's to help students get better at learning. I think we can use assessment for learning with lower level students. I think that we can be we can allow students to speak or choose what language they want to speak when it comes to discussing and reflecting on things. It's not always easy to do it in a foreign language. And as students get more confident with the content or with the meaning of what they want to express, then we can start teaching them how they can express this in English. I think you don't need to go all out and use every AFL technique you've ever heard in every lesson you teach. I think what's key is little and often is best. So if you've got a lesson that's mainly revision, maybe you don't need to introduce a learning objective. Maybe you'll choose to just do some reflection at the end of the lesson on the main things that happened. So you need to think about what works best for your students. It shouldn't be a burden to you or your planning. It should be something that supports your lesson planning and supports your students. Okay, I asked you at the start of this session to think about what you knew about assessment for learning already and what strategies you were going to use. Reflect on that a little bit now. So if you learned something new, then congratulate yourself. If you've got a lesson coming up at the weekend or next Monday, what strategy are you going to use? And if you had a question at the start of the session that I haven't answered, can you let me know now in the chat box and I will try to answer it. Yeah, so let me know now in the chat box if you have any questions. I can see lots of people writing. Good to hear that it's useful. I hope I'm not missing any questions. I know there are some people joining on Facebook too. Okay, I'm getting some questions, some from Facebook and some from the webinar room. There was a question about recommended sites for assessment for learning. Pearson have a very nice experiences site. You can see the link on the screen now. There are further webinars there on assessment for learning. There are some materials that you can download, some classroom posters. So that's one resource you can use. Somebody else has asked about feedback. I think that we need to give a variety of different feedback to students, but I think it's essential that it always involves something that students have done well, something that they can work on, and how they can do it. So that might be referring them to a page in the workbook. It might be referring them to an app where they can practice something again. I think it's also important sometimes to give grades because students need to know how they are doing as well, just in terms of their achievement. Someone else has written, isn't it better to praise the academic work rather than the ego? And that's absolutely correct. I completely agree with your comment. We want to praise what the students are doing, not the students, because we want the students to know why they're being praised, which they don't always necessarily realize. Someone asked about correcting pronunciation mistakes when students are reading. I get my students to read quietly to themselves. There are times when we ask students to read aloud. I think if it was a slip or a difficult word, I would probably just tell the student how to say it. If it was something that was important for everyone, I'd probably do a little bit of a post-teaching on it. But I think generally, if students are reading a text, they should be reading quietly. Okay. I think I can do one more. So somebody has asked about giving feedback during the pandemic because students are already stressed. I think feedback is really important because it tells us that we're being effective. So if there's no feedback, students might be left thinking, oh, I don't know if the teacher's happy with me, I don't know what I should work on. So I think it's important to give feedback. Maybe avoid very formal tests and exams. It would be difficult to administer online anyway. But I think we need to keep our students up to date with how they are doing. But I think the important thing about assessment for learning is it allows students to assess themselves. If we introduce these strategies during our online lessons, then we're giving students the tools to assess themselves, and then it's not some judgment coming from the teacher. I think as long as we always tell our students what they've done well and how they can improve, I think it's always welcome. And I think the last question someone asked, would I use it with young adults? I think you can use these strategies with every age group. I've used them with primary, I've used them with secondary. I think with adults, I don't teach so many adults now, but I think it's very useful to share with them the objectives, telling them what they're going to be learning, so that they can also reflect on it. So I would say these strategies are effective for everyone. Again, there are a lot of different strategies. It's about finding what works. What do your students enjoy? What helps them? It's there to help us. It's there to help students. It's there to help teachers. Thank you very much for joining today. Thank you if you were on Facebook as well. I hope that you found something useful today that you can go off and use in your own lessons. If you've got a lesson today or tomorrow, I challenge you to use one of the techniques. Just before I switch off, if you enjoyed the session, there are more sessions in this series next week, up until the 15th of May. So register for some more sessions if you have some time. Thank you very much again for joining. The webinar was recorded. You'll get a link to it soon. You'll also get a certificate and a virtual goodie bag. Thank you for all the comments in the chat box. I wasn't able to keep up with all of them, but I was paying attention. Thank you very much for joining, and have a lovely weekend. Thank you. Bye-bye.